800,000 letters are sent to Santa every December. But every year, postal workers quietly intercept a smaller pile of letters addressed to something darker names like Satan, Devil, or simply the one who answers. By the end, you'll understand why the popular story about writing a letter to Satan instead of Santa is completely wrong. The version most people imagine is simple. A child writes a letter asking Santa for toys, but if the letter is addressed to Satan instead, something supernatural answers. The internet version adds a ritual, maybe a burned envelope or a whispered wish at midnight. It spreads icily because it feels like a dark mirror of a harmless tradition. One lesser-known fact. Modern postal archives in several countries show that thousands of letters each year are actually misaddressed to mythological or fictional figures, and nearly all are quietly discarded without ever being opened. The myth survives because the structure of the Santa tradition already feels magical. Children believe there is a hidden network of elves, reindeer, and flying sleighs that somehow delivers gifts across continents in one night. Swap the name Santa for Satan and the imagination fills the rest. Another lesser-known fact. The modern image of Santa delivering gifts worldwide in a single night only became widespread after the late 19th century. Long after earlier European traditions of St. Nicholas who delivered gifts locally over several days, people assumed that if Santa represents reward, then Satan must represent punishment or forbidden wishes. The logic sounds neat, but neat stories rarely survive contact with real history. One lesser-known fact. Historical folklore rarely pairs Santa and Satan as opposites. Instead, most European traditions paired St. Nicholas with companions like Krampus or Knecht Ruprecht, who punished misbehaving children. The first myth people repeat is simple. If someone writes a letter to Satan asking for something, supernatural might answer. The idea sounds plausible because of centuries of stories about deals with devils. The folklore of Europe is filled with tales of contracts written in blood and signed under moonlight. A lesser-known fact. Nearly all documented devil contract stories in European archives were written centuries after the supposed events and were often moral fables created by clergy or local storytellers. What the myth leaves out is logistics of belief. Real societies treat supernatural letters as symbolic acts, not communication channels. When children write to Santa, the system behind the myth is parents, charities, and postal volunteers. Another lesser-known fact. In the United States alone, the postal program that answers Santa letters processes tens of thousands of letters every year through volunteers rather than any central magical office. When someone writes to Satan instead, the system collapses because there is no cultural infrastructure supporting the myth. No volunteers, no charity networks, no tradition of reply. A hidden constraint rarely mentioned. Myths survive when institutions quietly maintain them. Imagine the battlefield version of this idea. A soldier believes a rumor that a secret radio frequency allows direct contact with headquarters. He transmits messages all night, but there is no receiver on the other end. The myth fails not because radios do not exist, but because the system behind them does not exist. A lesser-known fact. During World War II, several isolated units repeatedly transmitted to non-existent frequencies after losing contact with command, wasting hours of battery power. Another myth claims that writing to Satan invites supernatural consequences, bad luck, haunting, or possession. It spreads because people connect forbidden acts with punishment. A lesser-known fact. Psychological studies show that when people perform actions they believe are taboo, they often report increased anxiety even when nothing external changes. That anxiety becomes evidence in their own mind. A strange noise in the house, a flickering light, a coincidence interpreted as a response. The missing detail is cognitive bias. Humans are wired to search for patterns after performing meaningful rituals. Consider the numbers. A typical home experiences dozens of small electrical fluctuations each year. Lights flicker, appliances buzz, pipe shift. A lesser-known fact. Studies of household electrical systems show that minor voltage fluctuations occur far more frequently than people notice until they expect something unusual. If someone writes a letter to Satan and later hears a noise in the attic, the brain connects the two events. Cause is invented after the effect. Another lesser-known fact. This pattern of post-event meaning-making is the same mechanism that fuels belief in lucky charms, curses, and omens across cultures. In a battlefield analogy, soldiers sometimes believe a certain helmet or ritual protects them from bullets. The ritual feels effective until the day it fails. A lesser-known fact. Military historians have documented dozens of battlefield superstitions, from lucky coins to ritual cigarettes that soldiers believed improved survival odds despite no statistical effect. Another myth claims the letter could summon something real, because demons in folklore respond to invitations. The claim sounds convincing if one only reads mythological texts, but those texts describe elaborate rituals involving symbols, timing, and invocations, not casual letters dropped in a mailbox. A lesser-known fact. Grimoires from the 17th century often describe summoning rituals requiring hours of preparation, precise geometry of circles, and Latin invocations, not written correspondence. The idea of a demon checking mailboxes is a modern invention. It appears mostly in internet horror stories from the early 2000s. A hidden constraint of folklore evolution. Modern myths adapt to modern technologies. In earlier centuries, people feared mirrors, crossroads, or forests. Today, the haunted object might be a phone number, a website, or a letter. A lesser-known fact. Folklore researchers track how supernatural stories shift mediums with technology, from haunted phonographs in the 1920s to cursed emails in the 1990s. The battlefield version, again, reveals the flaw. Technology changes the shape of belief, but not the mechanics of reality. Radios still require transmitters and receivers. Letters still require a reader. A lesser-known fact. More than 90% of military communication failures historically came from missing infrastructure rather than enemy interference. Another claim suggests that writing to Satan creates a symbolic contract. The writer offers something in exchange for a wish. It sounds convincing because legal metaphors appear often in religious literature. A lesser-known fact. The famous Faust story that popularized devil contracts was heavily fictionalized in German literature during the 16th century. The real historical figure, Johann Georg Faust, was likely a traveling magician or astrologer, not a man who sold his soul. A hidden trade-off appears here. Moral stories often exaggerate supernatural consequences to enforce social rules. If the tale warns children not to pursue forbidden desires, the devil contract becomes a dramatic teaching tool. A lesser-known fact. Medieval morality plays often used exaggerated supernatural punishments to discourage behaviors like greed, gambling, or deception. In the battlefield analogy, propaganda works the same way. Stories exaggerate threats too, enforce discipline. A lesser-known fact. Wartime propaganda frequently inflates enemy capabilities to encourage vigilance among troops. Another myth claims that writing to Satan reveals secret knowledge. The logic echoes ancient stories of demons who know hidden truths. But historically, those stories appear mainly in mystical texts written by small groups of scholars. A lesser-known fact. Many grimoires circulated in Europe were copied manuscripts with numerous errors, meaning even the authors could not reproduce the rituals exactly. The myth assumes supernatural beings operate like librarians of forbidden information. In reality, the stories functioned as intellectual puzzles or allegories. A hidden constraint appears again. Secret knowledge myths flourish when information is scarce. Before printing presses spread widely, most people had limited access to books. Knowledge itself felt mysterious. A lesser-known fact. By 1500, the Invention of the printing press had already produced millions of books, rapidly weakening the aura of mystical secrecy around knowledge. In the battlefield version, soldiers sometimes believe the enemy has secret weapons that guarantee victory. Those rumors spread faster when intelligence is limited, a lesser-known fact. During World War II, rumors of miracle weapons circulated widely long before any real experimental weapons appeared. Another myth claims that writing to Satan is dangerous because it shows moral corruption. The assumption is that the act itself transforms the writer. But psychology suggests something different, lesser-known fact. Behavioral studies show that symbolic actions often reflect existing attitudes rather than creating new ones. If someone writes such a letter as a joke, their beliefs rarely change. If someone writes it seriously, their beliefs likely existed before the act. The letter is a signal, not a transformation. In battlefield terms, a soldier who breaks discipline often shows signs long before the incident occurs. A lesser-known fact: military disciplinary records show that repeated minor infractions often precede major violations. Another myth insists that evil forces are always waiting for invitations. It paints the supernatural world as eager for human contact. But folklore across cultures actually depicts spirits as distant, unpredictable, or uninterested. A lesser-known fact: in many traditional belief systems, spirits were thought to avoid direct interaction with humans unless provoked through elaborate rituals. The idea of a demon eagerly answering mail is therefore historically inconsistent, even with the folklore it references. It is a modern horror trope, not an ancient belief. The hidden driver behind these myths is narrative symmetry. People like balanced stories. Santa rewards good behavior, Satan punishes bad behavior. Reality rarely follows symmetrical storytelling. A lesser-known fact: historians of religion note that many popular beliefs about Satan, such as horns, red skin, and pitchforks, developed in medieval art rather than early religious texts. Art simplified complex theology into memorable images. Stories simplified those images into moral lessons. And the internet simplified the lessons into viral myths. In warfare, the same pattern appears. Complex logistics become simplified into heroic myths about single battles or weapons. A lesser-known fact: historians estimate that more than 80% of wartime outcomes depend on logistics rather than individual heroism. Behind the myths about letters to Satan lies a deeper system of storytelling. Humans create symbolic opposites to explain behavior: good versus evil, reward versus punishment, Santa versus Satan. But the two figures evolve from entirely different traditions. A lesser-known fact: the modern Santa Claus combines elements of St. Nicholas, Dutch folklore of Sinterklaas, and 19th century American advertising imagery. Satan, by contrast, evolved from theological interpretations of adversarial figures in religious texts. Their pairing is accidental, not historical. Once the internet connected millions of storytellers, the pairing became irresistible. The dark version of Santa stories spread quickly. A lesser-known fact: early internet forums of the late 1990s played a major role in spreading urban legends about cursed emails, haunted websites, and supernatural messages. The battlefield analogy again exposes the mechanics. Rumors travel fastest when they combine familiarity with fear. A lesser-known fact: psychological studies show that frightening rumors spread significantly faster than neutral information within social networks. The deeper cause behind these myths is not supernatural communication, but human psychology. People seek meaning in rituals. Writing a letter is a ritual. Sending it to a mythological figure creates a narrative. And narratives are powerful tools for shaping memory and belief. A lesser-known fact: neuroscientists have found that stories activate multiple regions of the brain simultaneously, making them easier to remember than isolated facts. The final truth is simpler than the myth. writing a letter to Satan instead of Santa changes nothing in the physical world. No supernatural postal service exists, but the act reveals something important about how humans think. We construct systems of belief, attach rituals to them, and then interpret ordinary events as confirmation. A lesser-known fact. This feedback loop, belief shaping perception, appears in nearly every form of superstition studied by psychologists. The chain of causation looks like this. A tradition forms around a symbolic act. Stories exaggerate its meaning. Technology spreads the story faster. People test the ritual. Coincidences reinforce belief, and the myth grows stronger even without evidence. War teaches historians a brutal version of this lesson. Decisions made on myths often collapse when confronted with reality. A lesser-known fact. Many famous battlefield disasters began with commanders trusting assumptions that had never been tested under real conditions. The story of writing a letter to Satan instead of Santa is not about demons answering mail. It is about how human imagination fills empty systems with meaning, and in both war and folklore, the most dangerous myths are the ones that feel perfectly balanced, perfectly logical, and completely unsupported by evidence.
The number surprises most people the first time they hear it. More than 3 million letters addressed to Santa pass through the postal system of North America every year. Yet a smaller category of letters appears quietly alongside them. Letters addressed not to Santa, but to darker figures, the devil, Lucifer, or simply the one who listens. By the end, you will understand why the popular story about writing a letter to Satan instead of Santa is wrong, and why the real explanation is far more revealing about human behavior. The story that spreads online is simple. A child writes a letter asking Santa for toys. Someone else writes a letter asking Satan for something forbidden. The implication is that one letter brings joy, while the other invites something dangerous. A lesser-known fact, archives of several national postal services confirm that letters addressed to supernatural figures, Santa, God, angels, demons, appear every year in small but measurable numbers. People repeat the story because it mirrors something familiar. The ritual of writing to Santa has been reinforced for more than a century through family traditions, school activities, and advertising campaigns. Replace the destination of the letter, and suddenly the harmless ritual feels unsettling. A hidden constraint rarely mentioned is that myths become believable when they reuse a familiar structure. The modern Santa letter tradition itself is relatively recent. Children did not widely mail letters to Santa before the late 19th century. Earlier traditions involved leaving shoes by fireplaces or hanging stockings. A lesser-known fact, the first widely recorded Santa letter campaign was promoted by newspapers in the United States during the 1870s to encourage holiday engagement. Once the idea existed, it grew into a system. Postal workers sorted the letters, volunteers answered them, charities fulfilled some requests. In other words, the myth of Santa works because there is a quiet logistical network behind it. The dark mirror of that system does not exist. There is no volunteer office replying to letters addressed to Satan, no charity network delivering strange wishes. A lesser-known fact, most postal services automatically discard or archive letters addressed to fictional or supernatural recipients if no real address exists. Yet the myth continues because it satisfies a narrative instinct. Humans like symmetrical opposites, heaven and hell, angel and demon, Santa and Satan. But symmetrical stories rarely reflect real history. The figure of Santa evolved from the traditions of Saint Nicholas, a 4th-century bishop known for secret gift-giving. Over centuries, the story changed shape through Dutch folklore, German traditions, and American advertising. A lesser-known fact, the red-suited Santa familiar today became standardized largely through commercial illustrations in the 1930s. The image of Satan developed through a completely different process. Early religious texts describe an adversarial figure, not the horned ruler of hell portrayed in later art. Medieval artists exaggerated the imagery to communicate moral warnings to largely illiterate audiences. A lesser-known fact, the horns and pitchforks associated with Satan were inspired partly by imagery of pagan gods that medieval artists wanted to portray as threatening. Once these two unrelated figures existed in popular imagination, storytellers connected them. One rewards good behavior, the other punishes bad behavior. The structure feels neat. But neat stories often hide messy systems underneath. The first myth claims that writing a letter to Satan invites supernatural attention. The logic sounds persuasive because folklore is filled with stories about deals with devils. But the details of those stories rarely resemble the simple act of mailing a letter. A lesser-known fact, historical grimoires describing demonic summoning rituals often required complex preparations, including protective circles, specific lunar phases, and hours of recitation. Those rituals were elaborate partly because they were symbolic theater. The complexity reinforced the seriousness of the act. A single piece of paper dropped into a mailbox does not create the same symbolic weight. Think of it like battlefield communication. Sending a message requires a transmitter, a receiver, and a functioning network between them. A letter to Satan assumes the existence of a supernatural postal system. A lesser-known fact, during early radio warfare in the 20th century, entire military units occasionally transmitted messages for hours without realizing their receiver equipment had failed. The message existed, the signal traveled, but nobody was listening. Another myth suggests that writing such a letter creates a moral contract. The writer symbolically offers something in exchange for a wish. The idea echoes the famous story of Faust selling his soul for knowledge. But the historical roots of that story are far more complicated than the popular version suggests. A lesser-known fact, the earliest Faust legends emerged in German pamphlets around 1587, portraying the character as a cautionary example of intellectual arrogance rather than a literal contract signer. The myth of devil contracts became popular because it explained human temptation through dramatic storytelling. Greed, ambition, curiosity, these motives appear easier to understand when framed as bargains with supernatural forces. In reality, human decisions rarely involve demons. They involve trade-offs, incentives, and pressures. A battlefield analogy helps clarify the pattern. Soldiers sometimes believe enemy forces possess secret weapons capable of changing the course of war overnight. Rumors of miracle technology spread quickly during periods of uncertainty. A lesser-known fact, during the final years of World War II, German propaganda frequently promoted rumors of wonder weapons to sustain morale despite limited practical impact. The rumor fills a psychological need. It provides an explanation when reality feels uncertain or frightening. The myth of letters to Satan works the same way. Another claim states that writing such a letter brings bad luck. Strange events afterward are interpreted as punishment. This belief relies heavily on coincidence. Households produce dozens of minor unexplained sounds each week: pipes expanding, air ducts shifting, electrical relays clicking. Under normal circumstances, those sounds pass unnoticed. A lesser-known fact, studies of household acoustics show that nighttime temperature changes cause building materials to expand and contract, producing sounds people often interpret as footsteps or movement. When someone expects supernatural consequences, the brain begins connecting unrelated events. A flickering light becomes a sign. A broken appliance becomes a warning. Psychologists describe this process as pattern recognition combined with confirmation bias. Once someone expects a signal, ordinary events appear meaningful. A lesser-known fact, laboratory experiments demonstrate that participants who believe a room is haunted report significantly more unexplained phenomena than those told the room is ordinary. In battlefield situations, the same pattern appears. Soldiers under stress sometimes interpret harmless noises as enemy movement. Perception shifts under pressure. A lesser-known fact, military training programs include exercises specifically designed to teach soldiers how to distinguish genuine threats from false alarms during night operations. Another myth claims that writing such a letter opens a doorway. According to the story, writing opens a doorway for demons. But historical folklore rarely portrays supernatural beings as eagerly waiting for casual contact. Many traditions describe spirits as distant or difficult to summon. Ritual complexity acted as a barrier. A lesser-known fact, anthropological studies show that many ritual traditions intentionally include difficult steps to discourage casual participants. Complex rituals filter believers. Only the committed attempt them. A mailed letter, by contrast, is effortless. The myth, therefore, contradicts the logic of traditional supernatural beliefs. If anything, folklore would predict that supernatural forces require effort, preparation, and specific knowledge. Another claim suggests that writing such a letter reveals hidden knowledge. The writer hopes to receive forbidden secrets in return. The idea echoes stories of demons as keepers of ancient wisdom. But the history of knowledge transmission tells a different story. A lesser-known fact, early scribes made complicated errors, accidentally portraying demons as ancient wisdom keepers. The error persisted. The battlefield analogy again exposes the mechanics. When soldiers lack reliable intelligence, rumors about enemy capabilities multiply. Information scarcity breeds speculation. A lesser-known fact, intelligence failures during